it's one thing to sell books, but my main aim is to try and change the scientific world and the practice of science. And to this day, no student has been able to do a PhD on morphic resonance in any university, because even though lots of people have wanted to do that, they're told by the professors, if you do this, you'll destroy your career before you even start. What most people don't realize is how extraordinarily dogmatic the scientific world is. I mean, in every other area of human activity, we're used to plurality. You know, in literature, there's different schools. In politics, there's different parties. In a court of law, you get to hear the prosecution and the defense. You hear two sides given equal time. But it's not that way in science. The dominant orthodoxy controls the funding, the positions, the journals, the peer review system. And people are terrified of going against it. Not because they believe in it, but because they're just afraid they'll spoil their careers. And so the whole of the scientific world is full of people who don't really like this dogmatic materialism, but they don't like to speak out in public. I compare it to Russia under Brezhnev, you know, when people in public pretended to go along with communist ideology, but in private, how many really believed it? And when the Soviet Empire collapsed, how many totally committed communists were there? There were certainly some, but it wasn't everyone.
I just want to comment on what you were saying, and that is the vehemence. I mean, if they or anyone were critical or objected, they could do it in a pleasant discourse, or even with humor. But
yes.
To do it with such a severe, punitive thing, to me, means they are very fearful of the truth.
Yes. I think they are, but the thing is that there are these organizations, militant materialist organizations, who are very highly motivated. They think they know the truth. You see, they're not evil people. They just think they know the truth and that everyone else just has beliefs, false beliefs. And because I differ from them, they think I must be a charlatan or a pseudoscientist. And it wouldn't matter if it was just a few people, but it controls, this attitude controls the grant-giving system for science, the educational system, the school system, all over the world, in every country. And there are militant organizations based on this, for example, guerrilla skeptics on Wikipedia, who've taken over whole chunks of Wikipedia, my biography page, everything to do with parapsychology and alternative medicine, has been completely distorted to fit their agenda. So unfortunately, they have an influence, but I think it's waning, and I think they are frightened, but they do have a disproportionate influence.
So could you talk about that other side? Because since you've come out since the 80s, I guess you appeared on the scene with the New Science of Life. You've had a huge impact on people and ways of thinking. I think there's been a sea change, and because there's so many people looking at these ideas, there's more of an integration of this non-material worldview. Yeah. And how do you see that when you travel around the world? What signs do you see of that population sprouting up?
Well, I think there's a large number of people who've moved to a more holistic worldview, who've moved to a kind of post-materialist paradigm. But it hasn't really affected the official educational system, nor government, nor business. And say you look at the grant-giving agencies in government. In Britain, for example, the Medical Research Council is the government-funded body for medical research. And how much money do they spend on alternative and complementary medicine? The answer is absolutely nothing. Because they're convinced these people are all quacks and charlatans, despite the fact millions of British people go to alternative practitioners. And in fact, they've just closed down most medical research labs and centralized them all in one big one in London called the Francis Crick Institute. And Francis Crick was a molecular biologist, not a doctor. And the whole emphasis is to get down to the molecular level in medicine and make it all molecular. You know, about tests and molecules and drugs and genome sequencing and so on, but missing out everything to do with people's attitude, well-being, all aspects of alternative medicine. So although there's a big change in the general population, it hasn't affected our scientific and educational institutions yet.
Well, they say science changes one funeral at a time. Is that...
Well, it doesn't actually. I mean, the young people going into science today, most of them don't believe this, but they know that if they step out of line, they won't get jobs and careers. And it was much easier to get jobs in the 60s and 70s. Now, for everyone who does a PhD, only about 30% of them are going to get tenured academic positions. The rest will do 2 or 3 low-paid postdoc positions, and then at age 35 be spat out into the employment pool with unusable specialized skills.
What can we do to make a difference?
Well, I spend quite a bit of time thinking about that. One is to have alternative funding sources. There are now lots of billionaires with far more money than they can spend on private yachts and apartments in Manhattan and things. So, you know, once they've got all that, they've still got billions left over. And I think if some of them could be persuaded to fund alternative science, they'd make a huge difference. I have actually been talking to several billionaires. Some of them have got rich through tech type things. They like the idea of science. One of them told me that he's actually giving something like $20 million a year to MIT for their research, and told them he wants them to use some of it for maverick, paradigm-breaking, truly innovative research. And I said to him, well, what are they actually doing? He said, they're doing brain scans and genomics. And I said, well, that's just totally conventional. He said, yes, I'm so frustrated by it because, you know, that's just what I don't want them to do, but they take the money and then they just do all this conventional stuff. So it's a problem, but I have met several billionaires in the last few years who would like to make a difference. None of them have actually written a check to do anything. Well, he's tried to. So I know it's a very difficult problem, and it's certainly not the case that most scientists are committed to this materialist reductionist worldview. A minority are, but the others are just doing it for their career. They have to go along with it. So changing the funding source would be one thing. Changing the minds of scientists is another. And one of the things that's changing the most at the moment is psychedelics, because there's a big, you know, a whole renewed interest in psychedelics. Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list this year for weeks. And he makes it all very credible. I mean, I think one of his great strengths is that he's made the whole subject mainstream. There's now legal research going on in Britain and America. And quite a number of young scientists have taken psychedelics. And when they do that, they usually end up with a bigger view of consciousness. I mean, Michael Pollan describes himself as a materialist and an atheist. But by the end of his book, actually trying out psychedelics, he said he'd started out on this thinking consciousness was like a kind of bubble inside the head, just in human heads. He'd come round to the conclusion that it's rather more democratically distributed throughout nature. It does change people's view. And I think that's one of the things that at a personal level will change it. But there has to be institutional change as well, so that the syllabus changes and the actual research grants and what people can work on changes.